So we're going to start with the Jeff Keighley The Game Awards, which, for those who don't know, Jeff hosts the annual Game Awards each year in December. Tomorrow morning, as time of recording, the announcement of the nominees for Game of the Year and other categories are set to be announced. So we thought, given we're here at the Red Line, and that's a preempted for something that we're going to talk about later, since we're here, we're going to actually talk about who we think. So these aren't necessarily our personal picks, but these are the 6 games that we're going to predict will be nominated for the Game of the Year. Now, before we even go into that, Jeff announced over the last day or so a change to some of the rules that sit behind the nominations. The one in particular is the change to the nominees, and now moving forward, remakes, DLCs, remasters, and expansions are now eligible across all categories. Let's stop there. What is your, as I pull some random hair off my microphone, what are your thoughts on that as a whole?
Why? I get it. I get that they're trying to, like, for example, I think one of the DLCs that really spoke to me that I previously played was, if you remember, BioShock Infinite had a couple of DLCs. I think it was like Beneath the Sea or something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say it's something Burial at Sea.
Burial at Sea, that's
Jesus, I haven't thought of that in a while.
Is it right? Right. But they were expansions and extra DLC to the game, like story wise. But it was very different. And I feel like, you know, if you want to kind of recognize these different expansions or remasters or something like that, I understand kind of where they're coming from. However, I'm very much a purist in that sense, where if we've had Final Fantasy VII and now you're giving Final Fantasy VII like remake, well, how different of a game does it need to be before it can be, it's like basically standing on its own? And I know we had this conversation when the game came out about, you know, Game of the Year nominees and, you know, whether or not we would accept it. I'm still of the belief no. But then when we've got something like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is still a remake, however, it's like a sequel to the initial remake, and so now you're kind of blurring the lines between, is it an original game or is it actually, you know, a remake? So it's like, I don't like it, but I know where they're coming from, in a sense. Are you kind of on the same page in a sense, like for where you are?
Yeah, look, I don't have an issue with them forming part of the nominees, but I just don't think for Game of the Year particular, I just find it, I don't know, a bit of a sticking point.
DLC of the year.
Yeah, like, why don't we have expansion? Like, just like how we have best ongoing game, and then that's more like your Fortnite, your live services. Why not have, you know, recognizing best expansions to existing games, right? And then games like Cyberpunk would be a great example with their expansion that launched. Phantom Liberty. This is kind of giving away, I guess, one of the nominees, I would say, with Shadow of the Erdtree and Elden Ring. I've got a feeling that if expansions are allowed to be eligible for Game of the Year, I am going to think that perhaps Elden Ring is going to be nominated yet again. And for those who don't know, Elden Ring won Game of the Year in 2023. So, 2022. My God, has it been that long? 2022.
Yeah, it's been 2 years.
Yeah. So that's where I think this is all heading. Do I think that remakes, remasters, DLCs, and expansions should be nominated for Game of the Year in particular? I think no for remasters. Remakes, that's where it gets a bit blurry. If it's a one-to-one remake of like a modern-ish game, I tend to think no. Like, say Uncharted, the original Uncharted got remade, right? But it's or even like take Last of Us Part 1. Perfect example, right? Still the bones of the existing game, it just looks very modern. I don't think that should be nominated because that was Game of the Year, you know, nominated 2013, right, when the game originally released. But if it's a Final Fantasy VII remake, or even like, say, Silent Hill 2, which perhaps is another nominee, or in amongst other nominees, where it's taking a game that's fundamentally the same game, but expands on it to a point where it's like, you know how we can. This is probably a clean way of making the rule. If the runtime of the game is exactly the same, that's telling me that it shouldn't be part of the nominees. And what I mean by that is Dead Space remake, right? It's the same. Okay, that's probably not a great example because they did make some slight changes, but you get my thought process, right? If the game is fundamentally the same game, then I think it shouldn't be nominated for Game of the Year. If it's a remake or a retelling that takes a 20-hour game and makes it a 50-hour game and it's mostly new content at that point, then I think yes. Where it gets to expansions and DLC, it's just iffy, right? Because Game of the Year is supposed to represent, the game of the year that had the biggest impact. And perhaps that is a mobile game, and perhaps it is an indie game, like It Takes Two, or maybe it is an expansion to a game. I don't know. I just think it's a bit messy, right? The way that we have our nominees and nominations doesn't make sense anyway. Like Sifu being best fighting game. Just doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's my thoughts. Anything else you want to elaborate on further on it? Yeah.
Do you think that with, like, whether it's remasters or remakes, do you almost think we're kind of, if we're allowing them to have a nomination for Game of the Year, we're just basically allowing this double dipping of like a singular title, and we're kind of reinforcing the fact that, yep, if you go back to the well of the games that are already established, whether like, and I'm talking games, not game series, but games that are already established, and then, okay, we're bringing them up, 5-10 years later. Oh yeah, it's a different experience, but it's basically the same. Like, why are we rewarding that over something that's brand new?
I agree, 100%. It's like Last of Us Remake Part 1. Technically, it probably was the best game released that year, but we've done this before. So I tend to agree with you. Again, having their own categories, best remake. We get that many remakes. Like, I could think of, well, just this year alone, we had Silent Hill, we had Final Fantasy VII, we had the Pixel remasters. I guess they launched earlier, but they came physically. We had Dragon Quest just launched. Like, we're getting enough remakes and remasters now that they can have their own category, just like expansions and DLC could. I think that's what I would do. Now that I think about it, I think I wouldn't allow any of these in Game of the Year, but have categories that they could be represented in. And maybe they do cross over too. Like, say, I don't know, maybe Shadow of the Erdtree may get nominated for Best RPG, right? Because it was a big expansion that was nearly a standalone game. But then it's like, well, so we're kind of nominating a game that you had to basically finish the base Elden Ring. And even then you had to do like certain side things to access. It's not something you can just buy and play. It gets really messy.
I think you've already answered your own question. It's not a standalone game.
Yeah.
So how can it be Game of the Year?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. It's in the name, right?
That's it. Like, if it was a standalone expansion, you did not need to play the original base game, and you can get stuck into it.
Miles Morales.
Its own, Miles Morales. It is its own game. Therefore, 100% you can be nominated. Doesn't matter if it's kind of like, semi-storytelling or how we were talking about like the 0.5s or whatever, like of games that PlayStation could release. Like, yes, you could see it as that. However, Miles Morales was its own game. That can be a Game of the Year nominee.
Yeah.
But, the Spider-Man, the original Marvel Spider-Man, like the DLC packs, you couldn't put them as Game of the Year because you still need to have the original game, first off. And odds are you're going to have to play through it to an extent to be able to unlock the abilities and the equipment before you actually get stuck into the DLC. Otherwise, you're going back hand tied behind your back.
And before we even get into our 6, or I guess it's technically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games that we think will be nominated, it's important to look at the history as well, right? Like, if you go back to, let's go back to 2019. Yeah, 2019. We had Final Fantasy VII Remake nominated for Game of the Year, right? Sorry, 2020. Which, again, it's kind of in its class of its own because remake's really just a play on words. But even if we jump to 2019, Resident Evil 2. Even last year we had Resident Evil 4 Remake, right? So we've already set the precedent of remakes being eligible. This is kind of just expanding that further. And to what degree, we don't know, right? Like, this could just mean, again, they just appear in other categories. But I think this will lead us straight into our 6 games. I think this is telling me that Shadow the Erdtree, yet again, for Elden Ring, will be nominated this year as one of the 6 games. What are your...
I agree.
We
No,
agree.
I agree. I think 100% this is they're setting the standards. They're setting the bar early because there is this expectation that it will be nominated. I almost think it'll win purely because of change as well. Look, good on them, good on the team, good on the game.
I loved it. Yeah.
However, like as I was saying earlier, why are we rewarding going back to the well as a game of the year for an expansion to a game of the year that happened 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Like what we get? So what we get another expansion 2 years time, and that goes game of the year as well. So Elden Ring technically wins game of the year 3 years over 6 years. Like that. Like to me, if that was to happen, you'd be thinking, well, hang on a second. Like, was there just no other good games being released at the same time? Was it just Jeff Keighley's love child? We don't know.
He just wants the Bill Clinton kid to run back up on stage. Yeah, and I mean, Shadow the Erdtree, like, just to put a pin on it, is probably a worthy nominee. Like, it was basically a standalone experience. But I think I agree with you fundamentally with the idea that we shouldn't be giving, games that previously launched time to shine when there has been so many great games. In fact, I think this year's, for me personally, had more games that I enjoyed than last year, right? And 2023 is touted as one of the best years in a long time. But anyway, so Shadow the Erdtree is the one we both agree. Number 2, where's your mind take you for spot number 2?
See, I think Astrobot.
I agree as well.
I think it's one of those platformers that has been able to, I think through community has been able to transcend above just like the family genre. Because that's what a lot of these platforms are kind of built into. Like, remember Super Lucky's Tale a few years back? Very solid platforming game. I finished it, but game of the year, not quite. At least you've got the nostalgia as part of it. You've got the platforming. You've got the skill. You've got the difficulty curve. I think there's a lot of things going for Astrobot as a game that you would have it as part of a nominated for Game of the Year.
Yeah, it was critically loved. The gaming press loved it. It's a celebration of PlayStation's history, past, present, and future. And I think I heard someone say, like, it's kind of a bit of a celebration of, like, video games in general, right? Like, kind of taking it back. We don't get these games often. 3D platforms to begin with, but like a quote-unquote AAA platformer we don't see. Astrobot is, like, for me, in my top 5, my personal top 5. I'm probably giving away some of my answers here, but I do think that the industry will want to recognize it as one of the best games of the year. So I agree. I think number 2 would go to Astrobot. Number 3 for me, so far we've agreed on 2. I think we'll probably agree with the full list here. I think, if anything, there's probably games that are going to be missed on here that perhaps should have been nominated. Yeah. But I think Rebirth Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 is in the running, I would say, for Game of the Year this year. Obviously, it launched so early in February, so there is that recency bias that we often hear and see about with games that launch October, November, December, or October, November, being in the mindset of gamers that are the ones that often win. But I think Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a special game, a big step change to Remake in terms of taking the fundamentals of a game and then really expanding it. Like, you don't often see that happen, right? People forget Remake was not an open world game at all. So to take a game that's linear in nature, which is by design, right? Because Midgard is supposed to feel claustrophobic. The whole point of that is to feel like you're, in a town or in a city.
Yeah.
But to take that and then expand that out in record time, I would say, in 3-4 years. Plus the story is just fantastic. Yeah, what were you going to say? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Like, I agree. I think Rebirth is there, and like early on if you play Final Fantasy VII, the original one, like even I know the first like act sort of thing, it is very linear, and that's what the first game was, and then it kind of opens up a little bit once you leave Midgar. Well, once you leave the city, that's kind of where Rebirth goes towards. So I do agree. I think, yeah, Rebirth will be one of those nominated games. However, I think that there is another one that might, you know, pip it in like the RPG sense, which I think you are currently playing at the moment.
Yeah, Metaphor Refantasio by Atlas. Yeah, I think this is
Yes.
I definitely agree with this, and I've actually just ticked over 50 hours in this game. My first, I think, Atlas game that I'm going to finish, and I've got to say, I absolutely adore this game. I think that it's so funny, like the themes and the themes that this game tackles is so deep, and sometimes it can get, I guess, blurred by some of the anime-esque, I guess, characters and things like that. Like, it is got that layer of anime, which I like. But the more I sit and think about it, Metaphor is a special game. And I definitely think, yeah, I agree, will be nominated for Game of the Year. So I hope this is one you can pick up and play at some point.
We're 4 for 4 at the moment. By the way, for those of you watching and listening at home, we don't have a list of games in front of us.
No, we're just going off.
That we've put this beforehand, like where we can see what each other has done. We have not done that planning for this. We are purely going off what we've got ourselves.
Exactly. And I guess it's because we have great, we got a finger on the pulse when it comes to the industry, right? That's why you come to this podcast.
That's why.
For actual understanding of how things work. So 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth slot. Now, before you go into it, I do want to make the caveat of, not even a caveat, just something to point out. We are missing our token Nintendo game and our indie random game.
Yep.
Which that doesn't always happen.
Down, by the way, I have 2 put down.
Okay, because like games like Stray were nominated in 2022, and I'm not saying that this happens like, all right, we need to have a Nintendo game, we need a Sony game. Like, it's not, but it's a funny joke that often pops up. For me, I actually don't have games kind of in that space, but I can see one potentially being there. But let's go. What's your fifth nominee?
So the indie game, I think the token indie title, I think, will be Balatro.
Yes, I was torn between Balatro or Animal Well being...
Yeah, I looked at Animal Well, but I think Balatro, and now that it's on mobile as well, I think... Which... Does okay, for those of you who don't know, it's basically it's a systemic card game with like narrative elements. So think... It's a bad example, but think Inscription in a sense, where it's card game based, but there's story behind it. Basically, I don't want to like go too much into it, but yes, that was my pick for indie game. You went Animal Well, did you?
No, I had Balatro in my mind, but I think it will be between, like, if it's going to be any 2 indie games, it's going to be out of them. I'm happy to say Balatro. And maybe Animal Well just, wins best indie game or something like that.
Well, Animal Well was done by the team, which was, I think, Big Mode by Video Game Donkey.
Yes, yeah, he published it. And it was made by one person too. So, yeah, Balatro, let's put it there, all right, in our imaginary list that I'm just totally typing on the go. And I'm just going to write Blat. Yeah. Now, right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th spot. This is where it gets, for me, really difficult, because I think there are games that I think should be nominated that I don't. All right, I'm just going to say the 2 that come to mind very quickly. Black Myth Wukong.
Yep.
Helldivers 2.
Yep, they are literally the 2 that I have written here.
Now, obviously, they both can't be nominated if they're going to stick to the 6 nominees. So, in saying that, like, again, this is not my personal list, because if I was going through my rules, like, Shadow of the Erdtree wouldn't be nominated, and I probably would have Black Myth and Helldivers.
We'll do ours in a later show.
Where do we go? Now, there has been talk, I don't know how, again, this is all just tinfoil hat theory, that obviously there was a bit of drama behind Black Myth Wukong with the way it launched, on the platforms it launched on, some of the things potentially said by the studio, and maybe it was a translation error, maybe it was not. So there is some drama around that game. That if these games are being selected by media, that perhaps Helldivers 2 would be more favorable.
But even Helldivers 2 had their media issues as well, basically in Discords and stuff, and the creators basically saying if you don't like it, don't play the game, sort of thing. But they didn't say it as succinctly and as nicely as that.
Yeah.
But also, multiplayer games don't really get nominated, except for maybe Overwatch all those years ago.
That is true too. I just think Helldivers is like, you think about the year, and Helldivers, like, it's Sony's most successful new IP ever, and took the industry by storm for a long time. We forget how quickly this year's moved. Months. Which is a big deal for a game that the first one was a Vita game that was on PS4 that maybe 500,000 people played, right? Like, it wasn't, or maybe 1 million people played. Given this list and the one spot, I think Helldivers is going to get it in terms of the nominee.
Yeah, see, I've got 4 games that I had lined up for this last spot. So the Nintendo one was Echoes of Wisdom.
I hope not.
I don't think it's going to get there.
No.
So but I had my Nintendo game there just in case. The other 3 that I had, we've already spoken about Black Myth. We've already spoken about Helldivers 2. No. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2.
Yeah, and
recency bias, purely because of recency bias.
I think that game, I played it, right? Like, it is solid. I don't think it's anywhere near on the caliber of, like, say, a Black Myth or even a Helldivers 2 in terms of even player base.
I still think recency bias. Like, I don't think recency bias is in like a Dragon Age Veilguard getting nominated.
No,
although that's such a comfort game to nominate. It's such an easy one. I don't think that's going to happen. Knowing Keeley, I reckon Helldivers 2 will probably get it because there'll be outrage.
I think it has to. Like, I think it's just one of those things because it launched so early in the year. It has to be nominated because everybody was talking Helldivers.
It's the impact that it had.
Yeah. So this is, again, just as we wrap up, not our personal picks. We'll actually have a episode dedicated, our last show of the year in December. We'll go through our personal picks. We may be joined by a few special guests as well. So just to go over the list one more time again, this is what we're predicting will be announced tomorrow morning. Shadow the Erdtree, Astrobot, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor ReFantazio, Balatro, and Helldivers 2 being the 6 nominees.
That's a solid 6.
It's a solid 6. As I said, this year for me was like a better year than last year. Like, there is so many games that in any other year I think could be nominated. Like, I think Silent Hill 2 could have been nominated. I think Black Myth Wukong probably should be nominated. There's just games upon games.
2, Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth.
Exactly. The list goes on and on.
It's getting Satisfactory. Yeah.
I mean, in any other, like, okay even-ish years, like a game like Stellar Blade may even be nominated, right? Like, there's this year was like jam-packed with some really cool releases. So we'll see in the morning. What I'll do is, if you follow us at Twitter at busy_playing, we'll post this list after this show, and we'll see where we land 3 a.m. tomorrow. I'll be checking in the morning when I wake up, not at 3 a.m.
You'll be checking? Good, because I'm not staying up late.
No, not for an announcement of some names.